Scientists expected modern DNA technology to settle one of history's biggest mysteries once and for all. Instead, it made the mystery even deeper. When researchers re-examined the famous Shroud of Turin using advanced genetic sequencing, they weren't prepared for what emerged from microscopic particles trapped inside the ancient linen. The results pointed to DNA connected to people from the Middle East, Europe, North Africa, South Asia, and East Asia, all on a single 14-foot cloth that many believe once wrapped the body of Jesus Christ. But that's only the beginning. Decades earlier, a skeptical Jewish photographer was granted something no one has received before or since: 5 full days of unrestricted access to the Shroud. He arrived expecting to document a medieval forgery. What his camera revealed instead challenged assumptions held by scientists, historians, and religious scholars alike. For more than a century, laboratories around the world have analyzed this mysterious cloth with chemistry, physics, forensic science, digital imaging, and now DNA sequencing. Yet every new breakthrough seems to answer one question, while creating several more. Is the Shroud an ingenious medieval masterpiece, or an authentic relic that modern science still can't fully explain? Tonight, we'll examine the evidence, the DNA findings, the controversies, and the discoveries that continue to divide experts around the world. Subscribe now, because this story becomes more astonishing with every new discovery. Let's start with what we're actually talking about. The Shroud of Turin is a piece of linen, 14 feet 3 inches long, just under 4 feet wide, faint, sepia-colored, and on it, barely visible to the naked eye, the front and back image of a man's body, as if the cloth had been laid over him lengthwise, head to head, feet to feet. In 1898, a lawyer and amateur photographer named Secondo Pia got rare permission to photograph the Shroud during a public exhibition. He set up enormous glass plate camera equipment on scaffolding inside the cathedral, lit the dark interior with magnesium flash powder, and captured 2 massive negatives. That night, alone in his dark room, he developed the plates and nearly dropped them. Out of the chemical bath came a face, clear, detailed, closed eyes, a damaged nose, signs of bruising, unmistakably human. Here's why that mattered. Reverse a normal painting into a photographic negative and it looks wrong, flat, distorted, like a mask. The Shroud did the opposite. The faint image on the cloth is hard to read directly. Reverse it into a negative, and it resolves into something with real depth and proportion, like an actual photograph. Photography wouldn't be invented for another 800 years. So how does a medieval object behave like something only a camera should be able to produce? That question didn't go away. In 1978, a team called STURP, the Shroud of Turin research project, got something no one before or since has had. 5 days, October 8th through 13th, of completely unrestricted access, using the best scientific equipment of the era. More than 30 scientists, physicists from Los Alamos, chemists, textile experts, Christians, Jews, agnostics, with no shared agenda except curiosity. Among them was Barry Schwartz, the official documenting photographer, there purely for the technical challenge, expecting to photograph a debunking. Under magnification, his team found no brushstrokes, no pigment layering. The coloring only affected the outer 200 to 600 nanometers of the linen fibers, a fraction of how deep paint or dye normally penetrates through capillary action. Under ultraviolet light, the background linen glowed as old linen naturally does. The image areas did not glow at all, as if something had chemically altered exactly those fibers in exactly the shape of a human figure. Then came the strangest result. 2 years earlier, in 1976, researchers had run the image through a VP8 image analyzer, a NASA-built device that converts image brightness into three-dimensional relief, normally used on things like satellite terrain photos. Feed it a photo of a painting, and you get meaningless distortion because artists paint light and shadow the way they see it, not as literal distance data. Feed it the Shroud, and it produced a coherent three-dimensional human form. Darker areas matched parts of a body closer to the cloth, like the nose and cheekbones. Lighter areas matched parts farther away. STURP's own final statement, carefully worded, the image was that of a real, scourged, crucified human form, and it was not the product of an artist, not a claim about miracles, a claim that whatever this is, it isn't paint. The date that was supposed to settle everything, a full decade after that 5-day investigation, in 1988, the Vatican finally agreed to something scientists had been requesting since the very beginning: direct radiocarbon dating of the cloth itself. Small samples were cut from a single corner of the Shroud and sent, completely independently of one another, to 3 of the most respected radiocarbon laboratories on the planet: Oxford University in England, the University of Arizona in the United States, and the Swiss Federal Institute of Technology in Zurich. The results came back with striking consistency across all 3 labs. The linen dated to somewhere between the years 1260 and 1390 AD. Solidly, unambiguously medieval, centuries after the death of Christ, and right in the window when relic forgery across Europe was, historically speaking, extremely common. Headlines around the world ran with a single, simple conclusion: science had finally proven the Shroud was a fake. For the scientists who had spent 5 days in 1978 documenting an image with properties no painting could produce, this was a genuine gut punch. It seemed to directly contradict everything they had found. And for years, most of the public conversation around the Shroud simply ended there. Case closed, as far as most people were concerned. But scientists who went back and examined the 1988 testing methodology in detail started finding problems that have never been fully resolved. Here's the issue. The sample wasn't taken from the center of the cloth, in a controlled, ideal location. It was cut from a single corner, and not just any corner, but the one that had been handled the most frequently across centuries of public exhibitions, repairs, and religious ceremonies. That same corner sits close to the site of a devastating fire in 1532, which badly damaged the Shroud and required emergency repair work at the time, including patches and reweaving done by nuns tasked with preserving the relic. Raymond Rogers, a chemist who had actually been part of the original 1978 STURP team, later published research arguing that this specific corner showed clear signs of rewoven cotton fibers, carefully dyed to visually blend in with the older linen surrounding it, remnants, he argued, of exactly this kind of historical repair work. If Rogers was right, then the 1988 test may not have dated the original Shroud material at all. It may have dated a centuries-later patch stitched into the most damaged, most handled corner of the cloth, which would obviously skew the results toward a much younger age than the rest of the fabric. To be completely fair to both sides here, this remains genuinely disputed within the scientific community. Some researchers, stand firmly behind the original 1988 findings and consider the rewoven thread theory speculative and unproven. Others believe the sampling methodology was compromised from the very start, and that a single small sample from one corner should never have been treated as representative of an entire 14-foot cloth. Nobody to this day has been granted permission to take a fresh, larger sample from the center of the shroud that could settle this decisively, one way or the other. The skeptics build their case. Now, before we go any further into the newer research, it is worth pausing here and giving real, serious weight to the skeptical position, because it isn't lazy dismissal, and it isn't built on nothing. It is built on solid, historical, and forensic reasoning that deserves to be heard in full. Start with this. The Shroud has no clearly documented, independently verified history before roughly the mid-1300s in France. There is no reliable historical record connecting it definitively to the ancient world before that point. To a skeptic, that silence is the whole story. A relic that simply appears conveniently right as the medieval trade in religious relics was booming across Europe, a period when churches were actively competing with one another to acquire objects capable of drawing pilgrims, donations, and prestige. Some skeptics have gone further and proposed the image was the deliberate work of an exceptionally talented individual artist. One name that comes up surprisingly often in these theories is Leonardo da Vinci, floated as someone with both the anatomical knowledge and the technical imagination to potentially produce something this advanced, though the timeline for da Vinci's actual life does not cleanly line up with the object's documented medieval appearance, a detail skeptics themselves acknowledge complicates that particular theory. There's also a far less dramatic, more grounded skeptical explanation that a genuinely skilled medieval craftsman, using techniques that have since been lost to history, methods like bas-relief transfer, controlled acid etching, or careful scorch-based imprinting using a heated metal template, could theoretically produce a faint, negative-like image on linen without needing anything remotely supernatural to explain it. Multiple modern researchers have actually attempted exactly this kind of experiment, and some have produced partial replicas that mimic certain properties of the Shroud image, though notably none have successfully replicated all of its properties simultaneously, particularly the extremely shallow, uniform depth of the discoloration and the accurate three-dimensional distance data. Skeptics also point to something structural about the medieval period itself. Shroud-like relics weren't unique. Multiple true burial cloths, nails supposedly from the crucifixion, and thorns claimed to be from the crown of thorns circulated simultaneously across different churches in medieval Europe. And the overwhelming majority of these have since been dismissed by historians as fabrications, produced to satisfy genuine religious demand from pilgrims and donors. Why, skeptics reasonably ask, should this particular object be treated any differently from all the others? This is a serious, well-argued position held by credentialed historians and scientists, not a fringe objection to be waved away. And it's precisely because this case is so strong that what happened in the years that followed reopened the entire debate instead of settling it. A new way to read the fibers. For more than 3 decades, the 1988 radiocarbon date functioned as the effective final word for most of the public, until researchers realized there might be a way to examine the cloth's age without touching the same contaminated corner all over again. In 2022, Italian physicist Liberato De Caro introduced a completely different measurement technique called wide-angle X-ray scattering, or WAXS for short. Instead of measuring radioactive decay in a small, physically cut sample, WAXS studies the internal molecular structure of the linen fibers themselves. Cellulose, the core material that makes up linen, naturally degrades over time in a way that is actually measurable. Its crystalline structure slowly breaks down as a result of accumulated exposure to heat, humidity, and simple age. Researchers describe it as functioning like a slow, built-in molecular clock, and critically, it can be measured using fiber samples that had already been collected decades earlier, without requiring any new, invasive sampling of the cloth itself. De Caro compared the Shroud's fiber degradation patterns against a reference set of textiles with independently, reliably known ages, some dating back roughly 2,000 years, including material recovered from the site of Masada in Israel, a location historically tied to the Jewish revolt against Roman rule around 70 AD. The result did not match medieval linen at all. It clustered much more closely with the ancient reference samples, consistent with fabric closer to 2,000 years old, rather than the 700 years suggested by the 1988 radiocarbon test. Now, it is important to be honest about where this technique currently stands. WAXS is new. It has not replaced radiocarbon dating as the accepted scientific standard, and plenty of researchers want to see the method independently repeated, cross-checked, and peer-reviewed more extensively before treating these results as conclusive. But what makes it significant is that it is the first serious scientific challenge to the 1988 date that does not rely purely on contamination arguments about a single damaged corner. It is a completely different kind of measurement, using a completely different scientific principle, and it points in a meaningfully different direction, which meant that the fundamental question, how old is this thing actually, was suddenly back on the table in a serious way. Right around the same time, an entirely separate line of research was about to make the picture even more complicated. The dust that changed the conversation. In 2015, a research team connected to the University of Padua, led by Professor Giulio Fanti, was granted permission to attempt something that had never been done before at this scale on the Shroud: extract and sequence DNA directly from the cloth. Their goal from the outset was not to search for anything supernatural. There is no scientific framework that would even allow for that kind of test. No comparison sample exists. No established biological baseline for anything outside known human genetics. Their actual stated purpose was far more grounded and, frankly, more historically useful: to reconstruct the physical journey of the fabric itself. Where had it actually been over the centuries? Who had come into contact with it? How many different hands, across how many different regions, had left some kind of trace behind? The collection process demanded extreme precision, using sterile micro-vacuum devices fitted with ultra-fine filters. The team carefully collected microscopic dust and organic particles, not just from the visible surface of the cloth, but from deep within the tiny spaces between the individual woven threads, places where ancient material can sit relatively undisturbed for a very long time. They also examined preserved samples that had been collected during restoration work back in 1988, carefully stored under controlled conditions ever since. The risk of contamination throughout this entire process was enormous. A single sneeze from a technician, a stray skin cell from a priest handling the cloth years earlier, even one careless breath could completely overwhelm and distort any genuinely old genetic signal buried underneath. Because of this, every sample was processed in ultra-clean laboratory environments specifically designed to minimize that risk. using next-generation sequencing technology focused primarily on mitochondrial DNA. Mitochondrial DNA was the deliberate choice here for a specific scientific reason. Unlike nuclear DNA, it exists in many copies within every single cell. It is inherited exclusively through the maternal line, and critically, it survives significantly longer in old, degraded samples than nuclear DNA typically does. That combination makes it one of the strongest available tools for tracing geographic origin and historical population movement. For weeks, the sequences the team extracted were run against comprehensive global genetic databases, covering documented populations from every major region of the world. What came back on the screen did not resemble the genetic profile of a single individual at all. It looked instead like a cross-section of humanity itself, layered onto one piece of cloth. Breaking down what they actually found region by region. From the Middle East, haplogroups linked specifically to Druze populations, an ethno-religious group spread today across parts of Israel, Jordan, Lebanon, and Syria, known among geneticists for maintaining remarkably isolated, largely unchanged genetic lines across thousands of years, which makes them a particularly strong indicator of authentic Middle Eastern ancestry, rather than random noise. From Western Europe, haplogroups including U5b and H1 through H3, a result that, on its own, was not especially surprising, given that the Shroud has been physically kept in Europe continuously since roughly the 1400s, first in the town of Chambéry in France, and later in Turin, handled across generations by the Poor Clare nuns who repaired it, members of the Royal House of Savoy who preserved it, and countless pilgrims who came into direct physical contact with it during public exhibitions. But then the results became significantly harder to explain away. From North and East Africa, haplogroups L3 and M1A1, pointing specifically toward Egypt and Ethiopia, regions with deep, well-documented historical ties to some of the very earliest Christian communities anywhere in the world. From South Asia, haplogroups including M39, M56, and R8, genetic markers typically associated specifically with populations from the Indian subcontinent. And finally, from East Asia, haplogroups D4 and G2A, commonly found among populations connected to China. Sit with that full list for a moment. Middle East, Western Europe, North and East Africa, South Asia, East Asia, all identified independently on a single piece of 14-foot linen. If this object really is nothing more than a single 14th century French forgery produced in one workshop in one specific region of Europe, how exactly does it end up carrying identifiable genetic traces connected to populations in India and China? There simply wasn't a level of global interaction in the 1300s remotely close to what would be required to leave that kind of geographically diverse footprint by pure accident on one object from a single point of origin. The most cautious, mainstream scientific explanation offered for this is contamination accumulated gradually across real history, centuries of handling by pilgrims, clergy, and traders originating from many different regions of the world, slowly depositing layered, mixed traces of skin cells, sweat, and breath onto the fabric over an extended period of time. And this explanation lines up loosely with an old, partly legendary historical account of the object's reported journey, beginning, according to some early Byzantine and Syrian sources, in Jerusalem, then reportedly moving to the city of Edessa by around the 2nd century, a major crossroads that sat directly along the Silk Road, where caravans carrying goods and people from China, India, Persia, and Arabia would have regularly passed through and potentially come into contact with a relic reportedly displayed and revered there. From there, the account continues. The relic eventually made its way to Constantinople, a true, genuine melting pot city of the ancient and medieval world, before disappearing from clear historical record during the violent sacking of that city in 1204 and resurfacing, according to documented evidence, in France roughly a century and a half later. If accurate, that kind of extended, multi-region journey would explain a genetically layered cloth far more naturally than a single medieval French workshop ever realistically could. But it's essential to be clear here. This entire historical chain is disputed by many historians, and the genetic findings themselves have been directly challenged by other scientists in the field who point out correctly that ancient DNA analysis is notoriously vulnerable to contamination, degradation, and outright misreading, even under the most careful laboratory conditions. This is not, in any sense, a settled scientific question. It remains an active, ongoing, genuinely unresolved argument within the research community. The plants, the blood, and where the science stands today, DNA wasn't the only biological trail. Botanist Avinoam Darnin and forensic scientist Max Frey, working separately, identified pollen from 58 different plant species lifted from the cloth's surface. 17 were European, expected given its documented history in France and Italy. But nearly half of all the pollen came from a single thorny desert shrub, Gundelia tournefortii, a plant that grows almost exclusively in a narrow corridor between Jerusalem and Jericho, and it was concentrated specifically around the head and shoulder region of the image, the same area where accounts describe a crown of thorns. Now, the blood evidence. For well over a century, skeptics confidently argued that the reddish marks visible on the cloth were nothing more than pigment, substances like ochre or cinnabar mixed with a gelatin binder, a documented and relatively common medieval painting technique. That particular theory took a serious scientific hit in 2017, when a team led by Professor Fanti, working in collaboration with physicians from a hospital in Trieste, re-examined the stains using considerably more advanced tools, including transmission electron microscopy and Raman spectroscopy, both capable of analyzing physical material down to the nanoscale. What they found wasn't consistent with pigment chemistry at all. It was consistent with genuine human blood, specifically type A. Notably, the same blood type identified on a separate, similarly disputed relic known as the Sudarium of Oviedo. But this wasn't ordinary blood chemistry either. The samples showed elevated levels of creatinine and ferritin bound to hemoglobin, chemical markers that, in modern forensic and medical contexts, are strongly associated with severe physical trauma, extreme muscular breakdown, and intense physiological stress on the body. In plain terms, the underlying chemistry looks considerably less like something painted onto cloth, and considerably more like the biological aftermath of a real person who endured repeated, violent physical trauma shortly before death. None of this is unanimous within the scientific community, and it's important to say that clearly. Pigment-based theories haven't been completely ruled out by every researcher in the field, and the pollen sampling methodology used by Darnin and Frey has its own share of critics who've raised legitimate questions about contamination and sample handling during the original collection process decades ago. But taken together, the wide-angle X-ray dating results, the mitochondrial DNA findings, the pollen evidence, the blood chemistry, and the original image properties STURP, first documented back in 1978, you end up with a picture that no single, simple explanation, forgery or otherwise, has managed to fully account for. That's genuinely where the science stands today. Not a confirmed miracle, not a confirmed medieval fake, an object that has now been examined by more independent scientific disciplines using more advanced technology than almost any other artifact in the entire field of archaeology, and one that, even after all of that scrutiny, still hasn't produced a single explanation that everyone in the scientific community agrees on. Back in 1978, a skeptical photographer walked into that cathedral fully expecting to spend 5 days documenting proof of a fake. Nearly half a century of radiocarbon testing, DNA sequencing, pollen analysis, blood chemistry, and brand new dating methods later, the most honest answer researchers keep arriving at still isn't a confident yes or a confident no. It's simply, we don't fully know yet. And that, more than any single discovery in this video, might be the most genuinely remarkable thing about this object. So, what do you think the evidence actually points to? Leave your take in the comments below, and if you want more deeply researched mysteries told with this same level of detail, hit subscribe, because there's a lot more of this coming.